Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shambari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, we spend a lot of time talking about really everything and anything related to K-12 education, but particularly we have a focus on both literacy and math. Tonight, we're going to revisit the conversation around literacy and the importance of students accessing complex text and trying to avoid, quote unquote, dumbing down texts, even if students aren't ready for those texts. There are ways that we as educators can help students still access those complex texts, which will help students to grow and not keep them behind all the time and increasing that learning gap. With that said, I'm really excited to have distinguished professor emeritus at University of Illinois of Chicago, Dr. Tim Shanahan, joining us, talking about all his wonderful work on literacy. As many of my listeners might know, he's founding director of the University of Illinois at Chicago Center for Literacy. He was also a former director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools, and he has served on the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy under both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And again, anyone who's anyone in education and reading about education knows that Dr. Shanahan has also authored or edited over 200 books and articles and other publications. And most recently, and in fact, it's just been published, but it's only been published for about a month, is his new book, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. Dr. Shanahan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, John. I'm excited.
So, Tim, my first question that I'd like to really get into, when we talk about level text and complex text, could you give us a definition of what that actually means?
Historically, reading educators got the idea that if you wanted kids to be able to read, you had to match them to the text some way. And you would do that by testing the kids to find out how many words they could read correctly and how many questions they could answer, with the idea that you wanted kids in pretty easy text. In fact, probably the most popular scheme, the kids would read text with 95% word accuracy. So that would mean like every 100 words, they'd make no more than 5 miscues. And they'd be able to answer 75 to 89% of the questions that you'd ask them about the text, which I would say is pretty good reading. And so that's what they've been trying to teach kids out of, is text at those levels. So that would be level text is aimed at matching the kids' ability in a way that makes sure that there isn't very much for the kids to figure out, that they're going to be able to read the text with pretty high comprehension. They might have to learn a few words. They might have to figure something out. But for the most part, they're going to be able to read it fine. What I mean by complex text, I guess probably the best way to define it is just to say grade level text. So if you're a fourth grader, there's a very good chance that if, let's say, with the fourth grade book, you can't read it as well, what the teacher's going to do is put you in a third grade book or a second grade book. She's going to level you down. And of course, then the question becomes, wait a minute, if when I'm 9, I'm reading a second grade book, when do I get to read the fourth grade book? The fact is, you're eventually going to run out of time. The purpose of the grade level text, the Common Core state standards came out, that 47 states got together and came up with this scheme. And some of them have backed off of it since then. But in fact, almost everybody who's backed off of it has kept the grade level reading standards. They haven't backed off on that. And essentially, what had been done, it used to be just every publishing company had their own scheme for deciding this is second grade text, this is fifth grade text. What they did is they took Lexiles and I think four or five other of these readability schemes and came up with numbers for each grade level. They're going to be able to handle texts that are as difficult as what a freshman would be expected to handle in a college English class freshman year, what somebody would be able to handle in the workplace if they were 18 or 19 years old, what it requires to get into the military and to stick. And if you say, look, we've got this fifth grader, I'm going to teach them with a third grade book, you're going to guarantee that when that youngster graduates high school, they're not going to be able to fully participate in the society. So complex text, I would say, is defined by the states in their standards. And leveled text is typically means that you're going to adjust your assignment of kids to text based on how well you think the kids would do.
I love that example, and I believe it's very clear, particularly for our educators listening who might be new to teaching literacy. I have some, if I can push back on something that I often hear, Tim, in my coaching, and I'd love to hear your response to this, and that is this. So a teacher might tell me, because I often say the same things, John, that's great. We want all of our kids to be able to function in the workplace and to read on grade level. But the reality is, this student just can't do that. I have to level the text for this student to the third grade if they're in fifth grade, for the example you gave, because they just can't handle fifth grade text. It's just not accessible for them. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that the notion of differentiation is a good one. The notion that you have kids who have different needs and so on, and you have to respond. The problem in this case is the way we've responded is what I would call curricular differentiation. I'm going to teach you language at this level. I'm going to teach another kid language at a much lower level. In other words, I'm going to teach you different things, which actually can make sense in something like mathematics. You're definitely not going to learn to multiply before you can add. Fairly simple sequence. Language isn't sequenced in quite the same way. You can learn a 4 or 5 syllable word when you're 3 years old, and it's okay. It doesn't do any harm. It's not a problem. What we need in reading, any kind of textbook guided instruction, we could be talking science class, we could be talking social studies class. If you're going to be using a book, what you should be adjusting isn't the curriculum, but the instruction. We should be giving kids more support, more scaffolding, more explanation, chances maybe to read it more than once, various things that you can do to make it possible for kids to handle the text. One of the things I found when I was writing the book was we make these decisions about how hard the book should be based on the kids' oral reading errors. And that's not a bad thing. That's very reasonable. But the studies show that typically, let's say we give kids a book to read aloud, a text to read, and they read it and they make 20 mistakes in 100 words. If you have the youngster read the same text a second time without any instruction, just have the kid do it a second time, the number of errors drops by half. Just by having the kid read it twice, all of a sudden he's on grade level and he can handle this. And there's no reason for you to hold this kid back. And so, wait a minute, why are we making this big adjustment in the kid's learning possibilities for something that's that ephemeral that you can change that quickly and that easily?
I love that. If I'm understanding you correctly, Tim, the power of close reading and reading things several times, or reading parts of a text several times and chunking it and then moving on to the next part of the text. So, along with your idea of multiple readings, I think it would also help the students to reduce their number of mistakes that they're making as well.
Oh, absolutely. Not just reducing the number of oral reading errors, but also helping the kids to deal with the vocabulary, helping the kids to deal with the sentence complexity, helping the kids to relate ideas through it. There's just a whole bunch of things that make a text complex. And the fact is, if you take them in shorter pieces, you can deal with those and do rereadings and so on, so that the youngster actually can succeed in reading what at the beginning was too hard for them.
So now in your book, and we've already talked about the benefit of multiple readings, the benefits of chunking complex text so we can get our lower level readers reading on grade level and not always quote unquote dumbing it down so they could stay on track and not increase those gaps. Makes total sense to me. In your book, what are some of the other ways you recommend that teachers scaffold the grade level text to make it
Ooh.
easier for students
Certainly
or
one.
accessible? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we want the kids to be able to take on a text that they can already read. And let's say by the end of the week, we want this youngster to be able to read this text. Right. So we're going to raise their ability. And if we do that over and over again with text throughout a year, we're going to be increasing this youngster's ability to read text. They're going to be able to handle more and more. And so let's say this is a kid who he's maybe a fourth grader, fifth grader. The teacher says he's at a third grade level, a fourth grade level. I'm going to put him in easy books. And I'm saying, no, put him in the fourth or fifth grade book, keep him there. But one of the things that you might do is try to identify words that you think the youngster might not know that are in the text that make a difference in comprehending the text. They do it with science books and math books and health books and everything. It's even true in college. The words they identify are the important words that they hope the kids are going to learn long term. They don't pay any attention to this isn't an important word, but it's going to trip the kids up and they're not going to understand this text because of this word. It's going to knock them down. And so the notion of before we read, I'm going to familiarize you with some of the words in this text that you might not know is very reasonable. And quite often it's different than the words the publisher has hit on. But you want actually teaching kids words. I would argue teaching kids how to figure out words from context. And so I would I'd read the text before the kids do, and I'd go through and say, I don't think they're going to know this word, but I think they could figure it out if they actually read this sentence or the next couple of sentences. And so I'm not going to pre-teach this word. I'm going to have them read this section. And then when we're done, I might not ask them what the word means. I might ask them something that depends on getting that word meaning. And if he can answer the question, if he can answer the question, I have something to teach. And in this case, it wouldn't be the word meaning. We'd go back to the text and look at how do we figure it out. And maybe early in the year when I haven't done much of that, I'll model it. I'll show them, I came to that word and I didn't know what it meant either, but I read the next sentence and look what it says and what that made me think. And I'll show them how to do it. Later on, I'll say, gee, I think you should read the next sentence. Let's say, in other words, I'll guide them into it. You teach kids how to do that kind of thing. A second thing would be read the text ahead and look for sentences that you think are complicated. And I mean, different ways to look at that, especially long sentences. Sentences that have a lot of internal punctuation, commas, semicolons, and stuff like that. Looking at sentences that maybe do things like they start out the sentence, then they have a phrase that maybe modifies something in the first part, and then they finish the sentence. And the kids get lost in those. Or passive voice, or any number of things that might be complicated for kids. And again, I'm not going to go in and pre-teach that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with some questions that the only way you could answer them is if you understood that sentence.
Exactly.
And I'm just going to ask them along with any other questions that I want to ask. I'm not going to highlight the sentence. I'm just going to ask it. And if they can answer it, I was wrong. If they can't answer it, we're going to go back and I'm going to start showing them, how do you break down a sentence like that? How do you figure out? Because I see, especially older kids, high school kids, middle school kids, they read a couple of sentences like that in a row that they can't get. They start turning pages. They not only miss those sentences, they go 3-4 paragraphs ahead because they're lost.
You know what's really interesting about what you said there, Tim, is I think you're leading right into something I was going to ask you, which is the power of guided instruction. To your point about if the student isn't getting the sentence, what could the teacher be doing to help them get the meaning of that sentence without flipping page after page, right? So I'm thinking of the I do, we do, you do model, or even if you flip that to you do, we do, I do, still there's that guided practice. What are your feelings about how teachers, if students are still not comprehending those sentences, how they could backtrack and narrate their thinking and provide that guided instruction?
With my sentence example, I would do very much what I suggested in teaching vocabulary from context. Initially, I might read that sentence to the kids and go, man, I have trouble with that sentence too. Let me show you some of the tricks I know for dealing with sentences. One of the things I know is that a lot of times, if you have two commas in a sentence, the part between the commas is like an extra idea. Cross that out for a minute and just read the rest of the sentence. Then you read the rest of the sentence and have the kids tell you what it means, and they can do that. And then you put back to the idea. Did you guys know that? No, I didn't know that. Okay, maybe you want it to stick. Maybe you're going to identify more of those sentences and pull them out and give the kids some actual practice. Remember last Thursday when we did that thing with that sentence and you guys weren't getting it and I broke it down for you? I've got some more sentences here. I want you to see what you can do with these and see if they can do it. But of course, you can also just stay with the guided or directed reading, because that's going to come up again in the next chapter. That's going to come up in other stories and articles that you read in your class. What do you guys notice about this sentence? Did we talk about a sentence like this before? So initially, I'm going to show them, but over time, I'm going to start setting it up to guide them to it. And then I'm going to expect them to do it. I'm going to get on their case when they don't, just a good teacher does.
Exactly. And I'm also thinking now that you're speaking, Tim, I had recently as a guest Gwen Pawlowski, who wrote a book on helping students to comprehend informational text. And she was talking about avoiding embarrassing popcorn reading with students, but yet at the same time, talking about how to have students engaging maybe in smaller groups or in pairs to discuss what they're reading. Almost like what you were just talking about as the teacher narrating all of that. How could students be discussing their reading with one another, but in a way that is emotionally safe? What are
So
your thoughts on that, Tim?
there's so many different variations on how you can do this. So let's just take two or three different ones. The first one is something like popcorn reading, where I'm going to call on you to read to the whole class. And I'm going to see a lot of secondary students who literally go, no, they balk. I'm just not going to do it. So let's talk about that one first. Because in fact, one of the things that especially for kids who you think that one of their problems or their big problem might be they're going to have trouble just decoding enough of the words to comprehend this text. That's what's blocking them. One of the things that you can do about that is have the kids engage in some kind of fluency practice, preferably before you take on that text for reading comprehension. So let's say in my science class on Monday, we're going to start reading this new chapter in class. I'm going to want the kids to read the first section silently. These aren't little kids, but boy, some of these kids, if they could practice it orally ahead of time, would be way ahead of the game and would do much better. We've got an intervention teacher, and instead of having her teach the kids reading, I'm wondering if last week she could have taken on this chapter with these particular kids and had them practice their oral reading. I'm going to suggest a little different than something like popcorn, which a lot of teachers do because they think the text is hard for the kids. Is either the teacher reads it to the kids, which I'm against, or she has the best readers read it to everybody, or she does something like popcorn. And what I would suggest, and I'll use an analogy. I think everybody has probably seen a basketball game, watched it on television. And there are two instances that are interesting in a basketball game in light of what we're talking about. One is when the game's on the line, the last 30 seconds of the game. What do? They foul the worst shooter on the other team. The reason they do that is because they want them to have to go up and take a shot that they're sure he's going to miss, and everybody yells and screams, and all eyes are on him. And I think that's like calling on a kid and saying, John, would you read this to the class? Who wants to be in that situation?
Exactly.
Okay, there's another time. It happens twice in most basketball games. It happens at the very beginning, just before they get started. It happens when they come back from the halftime. And that is every player on both teams is on the court, every single player, and they're all shooting. In other words, there are maybe 25 basketballs flying through the air at any given moment, and nobody cares. Everybody's practicing, and nobody is getting, oh my gosh, I can't make the shot. It's not like that because everybody's doing it. So in the class, let's say you have 24 kids in the class, you got 12 pairs doing the reading.
Exactly.
It's not embarrassing in the same way. So that's how I would handle that kind of thing. In terms of the whole class kind of thing, now we're reading this text, and I'm going to have the kids probably read it silently, most of it read it silently. And I'm going to ask some questions. And typically, the teacher's going to ask these questions of the whole class. And you can do that. And sometimes that works well. And sometimes it has the impact that your guest suggested, that kids get upset about it. But I'm thinking of something else. I'm curious as the teacher who's having trouble. Like if I ask one of those sentence questions that I talked about, or one of those vocabulary questions, once one kid answers it, then everybody knows the answer. And so I never know who's having trouble, which is not a good position for a teacher to be in. These days you can do it electronically, but literally having the kids write down their answers on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, or like I say, it's even better now, just pop it in and teacher can look and go, wow, these 6 kids couldn't answer the question. Wow, 12 kids couldn't answer the question. And what that means is I can look and say, wow, some kids didn't get it. I want to show them how to break that sentence down. I can do that with the whole class and nobody knows who had the difficulty. And so I really get to instruct everybody in it and bring them all along with it.
And it's great that you're talking about, because I asked it more about oral discussion, but you just brought in how writing and oral discussion could definitely be helping reading and literacy overall. And I'm thinking too, Tim, on the, at least on the middle school and the high school level, maybe even on the elementary level, yes, there's reading for the sake of learning how to read, but then there's reading to extract information.
Yes.
So I'm a big fan of discussion protocols like Save the Last Word for Me, where a student starts and talks about this is the phrase, the sentence, the word that resonates with me. And then everyone in turn talks about what they think about what resonates with me. And then it comes back to me, and I synthesize what everyone else said about what resonated with me. And then we go to the next person and do the same thing. So, to your point about teachers being able to really ascertain how students are interpreting and understanding the reading material, in addition to even just writing down those sentence starters that you were talking about, each individually, and then the teacher looking at them individually and going, like you said, these 6 got it, these 6 don't. I'm also thinking that's even more reason to be doing these discussion protocols and having students in groups write down some of their findings. That's another way teachers can really see if teachers are translating what they're reading into their own knowledge, if that makes sense.
It does. That's why I say you can't always have the kids write in the answers, and that can both feed discussions and it can kill discussions. And so you have to be adept in using them and not overusing them and mixing. Sometimes you do talk about it. You do ask questions of kids, and if they can't answer it, there might be embarrassment. But a good teacher, a good discussion leader can actually tamp that down. It doesn't have to be embarrassing. I think you could find, I bet if you interviewed kids, you'd find very quickly that Mr. Jones, I hate when he asks questions because if I can't answer it, I feel like an idiot in his class. But Mrs. Wolf does that. It doesn't bother me. She's doing something a little different.
Exactly. So now let's talk about the elementary grades. You're talking about students learning words by reading the context around that word. How does phonics play into learning how to read?
Phonics is really important as a beginning tool. Think about what phonics is. It's simply a set of instructional routines aimed at teaching kids the relationships between letters and sounds and spelling patterns and pronunciations. That's all it is. And we've tended historically to teach that in kindergarten, first, and sometimes second grade, those grades. And research says that really helps kids to get started. It allows them to figure out the new words and so on and so forth. We have some data now that are saying we're finding older kids, middle school, high school, who are below a certain threshold of word reading that seems to block them from any kind of reading progress during middle school and high school, no matter what the intervention, no matter what the scheme. We haven't done a very good job with getting those older kids to move along. But these studies that came out of the Educational Testing Service say if those kids aren't above a certain level when it comes to being able to read words and understand word structures, frankly, they don't make any progress in reading from 6th to 12th grade, no matter what we do. But they're not talking about beginning phonics. It doesn't teach the kids the P sound and can they sound out cat. Most of those kids can already do that stuff. What they can't do is they're not able to handle multi-syllable words. They're not able to handle some of the complex and weird spelling patterns in English, like in the word whistle. They don't have a strong knowledge of morphology and the structure of words and the meaningful parts of words. And so we really should be, in addition, there should be time there where kids are studying words. They're studying them phonemically in those primary grades and learning how to sound them out and spell them. As they move up the grades, they're still working on the spelling, but now they're working more on morphology. They're working more on how do you sound out a 3-syllable word? How do you break them down? What do you do with those? And when you sound it out and it doesn't make sense, what are the alternatives? Our spelling system's a complex one. Usually with second graders, or these days, first graders, we teach them what a pattern C, V, C, E, and what consonant, vowel, consonant, silent E, right? And so you get words like dome, you get words like came, and oh, look, they work. And they do work really well. And so what you want kids to do is to look at a word like that. And if they don't know it, the first thing they should try is done. That doesn't make sense. What are my other choices? What else can I do with that O in English words? And you teach kids not just a single simple match, but under some conditions, you're going to have to, the second choice might be, let's try that and see what you can do. And so we need to keep that kind of instruction really going on through the grades. Kids should be studying words, their meanings, their pronunciations, their spellings, their structures, really from the beginning of school all the way through.
Indeed. Now, what is your take on there's reading in ELA where you're focusing on the literature or the structure of the text. And then there's reading in science and social studies and math. Is it just as important for them to be reading complex texts in subject areas when the goal is the subject?
Yeah, I suspect that it does still matter. And the reason for that is because, well, we think of reading as being highly generalizable. If you can read in your literature class, you're going to be able to read in your science class. The fact is, the language is so different. Even grammar is different. It's really bizarre. If you have a really good English teacher, she's probably going to teach you when you're writing that the verb should be like the second or third word in the sentence. It should be right up at the front. In a science class, the verbs are almost at the end of the sentences these days. And that's been moving over the last 50 years.
Right.
English is becoming much more German because of science. And so at times, I think we need the science teacher to say, Listen, this is different than reading that story in your English class. Let me show you what we're doing. Another piece of it is, as you, especially once you get middle school and high school, the purposes of reading change. If you look at history reading, for example, history uses a very different kind of evidence than we use, say, in a science text. What are you looking for? You're looking for plausible explanations. You're looking for people making arguments. How can I convince you that George Washington did this for a given reason? And here's why I think that. Here are the kinds of things that lead me to believe that. In science, I don't care what people's opinions are. We need data. You have to be able to show me. And so the nature of evidence changes, the nature of argument changes, and you're probably the best place to learn those things is probably from a science or history teacher, not from an English teacher. I'm not sure that the English teacher is always the best person to teach you how to read science. They often go out of their way not to read science.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, Tim, you are making an argument that the text should still be complex
Yes,
because there is still that literacy. It's just a different kind of literacy,
exactly.
evidence based.
What we're seeing these days, I just got a bunch of emails in the last 2 or 3 weeks from people wanting to know about these new AI schemes that, oh, you want your ninth grade science book rewritten at third grade level? We can do it. I would be very skeptical because the complexity of the information is not the same. The level of detail and so on is not the same. And you're not really preparing these kids to do things like being able to move into science-based jobs like in healthcare or being able to move into science studies in higher education. And so I think it's really, even though my book is about teaching reading, if you look at the chapters about how to scaffold kids reading, you can say that's for reading content area 10th grade books. This text actually gives you some skills and routines that would allow you to guide kids through those readings and be much more successful with that.
So I'm glad that you reintroduced your book. We've talked about a lot of different concepts in terms of reading tonight. Tim, what did we not discuss that's in your book that you want folks to know about?
A lot of times, what people tell me, now I get less of this from the secondary teachers than elementary teachers, but I get emails from people wanting to know why I'm so mean. The thinking is if you put kids in books that are really hard, the kids are going to feel really bad. They're going to hate reading. They're not going to be motivated. Why would I do that to children? There's been a belief for years and years that if you put kids at their level, they won't be discipline problems because they'll be able to read the text. The reason kids act out is because the curriculum's too hard and they get upset, they get frustrated. And so that's why they're acting out. And so if you teach kids at their level, you're going to fix it. There are studies. There's a widely cited study. They only cite half of the study, though. They leave out the second part. What they did is they went into classrooms and they figured out the kids' reading level versus the text levels that they were working with. And no question about it, the kids, those who were the most frustrated, acted out the most in the classroom. And that's the part that everybody cites. What they did then is since they'd identified those kids, they went in and changed their reading, the text that they worked with the kids. They moved them all to text that the kids could read as easily as the rest of the kids. Guess what? They still acted out. Nothing to do with it. That low readers are more likely to be put in frustration level materials than higher readers for obvious reasons. If I read at what the reading people would say is a third grade level and I'm in fifth grade, the fifth grade book's going to be harder for me than that better reader who you think is on level. Just no question. But I'm also a kid who, for various reasons, is more likely to act out.
Yeah,
And it's not the text level that's doing that.
correlation, not determined causality.
Causation. Yes, exactly right. Another aspect of it that I started thinking about really hard and hadn't thought about as a teacher when I was doing these crazy things, thinking I was really helping the kids because everybody's doing this in a well-meaning way. We're going to make sure these kids are successful, even if they're doing baby stuff. That doesn't turn kids on at all. They're not stupid. They look and go, I'm 9 years old. Getting to read the book that the 7-year-olds are reading is not really terrific. I don't feel good about that. If you think about it, the various reading schemes say if a kid is reading this well, you should have them in a book like that so that it's just slightly above his level. And so there'll be a few words to learn there and maybe something to figure out, but it's going to be, in other words, if you're really successful and you learn from what the teachers are doing, your gains are going to be imperceptible. Think about what that means in terms of motivation. And when we look at surveys, the majority of elementary kids say they hate reading class. They do not like it. And I would argue in their other classes, they have a sense of learning. In reading, even if you're making progress, what the teacher's immediately going to do is move you to a harder book so that you still can't tell that you're doing any better. And what I'm suggesting is put kids in a book where there's some distance between the youngster and the book so that when you close that gap, the kid can go, yeah, I saw it. I didn't think I could do that on Monday. On Friday, wow, I got it. I can handle that story. I can handle that article. I know how to break that thing down. And next week we'll come back and kick their tail again.
And that relates to what you were saying before, Tim, about it being about instruction. How is the teacher then going to help the student narrow that gap? And
That's where the scaffolds come in. That's where instruction comes in. What we've done in the past, it seems to me, is we've taught reading by having kids practice. Now, what I'm talking about is no, we're going to teach kids to read. We're actually going to teach them to read. We're going to teach them how do you make sense of a text. We're going to teach them how to track the pronoun references and the synonym references through a text. We're going to show them how to find the verbs and the sentences. We're going to show them how to use the structure of the text. We're going to show them a lot of things that allow them to take a text that they can't yet read, and now they can. That's the whole idea. Teaching kids how.
now, Tim, one or two other questions before I let you go. And one question I'd be curious to get your answer on is, have you seen any particular schools or districts do a really good job with teaching reading in the way that you're advocating?
I haven't, in part because these days, since COVID, I really don't get into schools very much. It's really hard to get into schools. I'm sure I've visited more than 1,000 classrooms over my career, but not recently. However, there's a recent study that came out that I think is really fascinating. This was data that they got from Stanford University. And Stanford identified 28,000 plus schools. The average kid is below level. These are schools that are dealing with struggling learners. In those 28,000 plus schools, about 1,300 of them are managing to actually catch kids up. 5% of the schools. So then they went in and said, what's different about these schools? And they found a couple things, but the one that's pertinent here is these schools in reading and math taught the kids on level. They didn't drop them back each year. Since you're reading a third grade level, you're going to start the third grade book again. You're in fourth grade. We're going to teach you the fourth grade reading curriculum. We're going to teach you the fourth grade math curriculum. And those schools are catching their kids up. The other schools are holding them back. Imagine you're that kid. You're in second grade and the teacher's got you in first grade stuff. And then you're in third grade and maybe she keeps you in the first grade stuff. You move to fourth grade and she drops you back to grade 2 again. You're never going to catch up.
Right.
But man, you get in there in September and October and the teacher is teaching. Whoa, it's a whole different world. So I would argue that 5% of the schools in the United States are doing the kind of job that we would want our kids to have. If they're behind, we want them to catch up.
Couldn't say it better myself, Tim. Tim, any parting words for our listeners?
I would say that teaching kids with grade level text is challenging. It's straightforward, but it's hard work. On the other hand, I can't think of anything more respectful that you can do for children. I can't think of anything in reading education that would give a larger number and percentage of kids a chance for all the benefits that reading can give them in their life as they go through their life. I think what we're talking about here is extremely important and something that could really make a difference in the life of those kids and in their communities.
Indeed. So, Tim, where can people find out more about you and the work you do?
I would suggest if you want to do that, go onto my website, Shanahan on Literacy. I have a blog, I have a podcast. There's a ton of free publications there. There are lots of links to all the other good stuff out there on teaching of reading.
I love how you always have a piece of artwork related to reading and literacy. I did note that, Tim.
They're beautiful, aren't they? And I didn't paint or draw any of them. Wish I could.
All right. So your blog, your website, they could also check out your new book.
Yes. And the new book is from Harvard Education Press, and you can get it at Amazon, and you can get it if you go to Harvard Education Press, you can find it there.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your time tonight. This has been a very informative conversation.
Enjoyed it, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.